Well, that was an excellent talk, and yeah, actually, it goes well with the situation in Russia because you also have, for instance, Foreign Affairs had the title. The Foreign Affairs is the Council on Foreign Relations, or Wall Street's think tank, and the title of the article was "Hitting Russia Where It Hurts," and that's clearly the goal. And President Obama, yeah, we think he's more enlightened than Trump and these dinosaurs around him. But Obama made similar, kind of boasts about how the sanctions were hurting Russia, and it's always the most vulnerable population, as Greg was pointing out, that's affected. Let me start with a quote from the Zimbabwean Chronicle. I found this article by a Zimbabwean named Pangani Kahuni. He said, like Ghana during Kwame Nkrumah's era, the Democratic Republic in the period of Patrice Lumumba, and Guatemala during its land reform era between 1950 and 1954, Zimbabwe suffered the same imposition of these devilish, illegal economic sanctions, cherished only by the West outside the UN endorsement. In this case, Zimbabwe was targeted because Mugabe stole the land took the land back from the white farmers. Although, of course, there are some problems with his regime, but there are a lot of terrible regimes in Africa that weren't targeted by sanctions. It's always very politicized, these sanctions. And the historic examples given, including these other cases he's pointing out, with like Lumumba, it's usually socialist regimes or leaders that are targeted who don't subscribe to the U.S. dictates and the U.S.-led global order. To quote from the Zimbabwean writer, in the historic examples given above, the purpose of the illegally imposed Western sanctions was the same. The most critical one was to make the people suffer so that they revolt against their democratically elected governments. The vehicle for success, which the West employs regardless of how inhuman it is making the targeted country's economies scream, with what Kissinger said about Chile in the attempt to undermine Salvador Allende, raising the unemployment figures thereof. Once industries close and unemployment skyrockets, violence triggered by labor organizations erupts. The government, as it tries to manage the violence, is accused of heavy-handedness. The international community is inadvertently told of falsehoods in which government is accused of committing crimes against humanity, regardless of the fact that such a scenario would have been deliberately played up by the accusers. And I think we see this template played out in country after country, sometimes successfully from a U.S. vantage point, sometimes not. And Venezuela is clearly one case where it's being played out, and Russia is another. But I think in the Russian case, Russia has been fairly effective in resisting U.S. design. So I'll focus the second half of my remarks on Putin's policies and his adoption of import substitution policies, movement away from neoliberal model, and how that has had effect in mitigating the sanctions in the Russian case. Putin had told NBC reporter Megyn Kelly in March 2018, listen, sanctions have nothing to do with the myth of some Russian interference in the U.S. elections. Sanctions are about something else entirely, the desire to halt Russian progress to contain Russia. Setting aside the issue of the elections, the remarks pertaining to the purpose of the sanctions are corroborated by a 2019 report issued by the RAND Corporation, another this is the leading Pentagon think tank. This report is entitled Overextending and Unbalancing Russia, a little basically saying the same in the foreign affairs, hitting Russia where it hurts. This report assesses how an array of foreign policy measures, from encouraging domestic protests to providing lethal aid to Ukraine to undermining Russia's image abroad, might weaken and destabilize Russia. And they're openly talking about destabilizing the country. The project's researchers found that economic cost-imposing measures held particularly high likelihood of success, including an expansion of U.S. energy production, which would expand world supply and depress global prices, hence hurting Russia, and also the imposition of deeper trade and financial sanctions if these sanctions were comprehensive and multilateral. So that's the clear strategy as part of a program to destabilize Russia. But yeah, again, my argument in this paper is that the sanctions have been harmful, like in Venezuela, but Russia has responded with import substitution policies, which I can discuss. The sanctions are also very problematic because they've increased tension between two major world nuclear powers and have helped drive forward the new Cold War. So the sanctions, I think, should be opposed on that grounds as well. In this case, they're particularly dangerous in igniting hostility with a major nuclear power, on top of the humanitarian effects. But I think one thing that is unique about the sanctions in the Russian case is that they seem to be driven by private lobbies and billionaires who lost out when Putin took back national control of Russia's economy from Boris Yeltsin in the Wild West days of the 1990s. When the Harvard boys, I don't know how familiar people are in the audience about the recent history of Russia, but following the collapse of communism, the shock therapy specialists from Harvard University were sent to remake and rapidly privatize Russia's economy, and a lot of the Russian wealth was looted, many by foreign business elements. And when Putin took power, for all the flaws of the Putin regime, one reason that Putin has popularity in Russia is because he basically took back Russian control over its own economy and expelled some of these predatory financial interests and capitalists. One was a man named William F. Browder, who was the key figure promoting the Magnitsky Act. That was the sanctions were first initiated under the Magnitsky Act in December of 2012. It was a bill first promoted by Senator Ben Cardin, because prior to that point, the Obama administration had adopted a reset policy towards Russia, was trying to ameliorate U.S.-Russian relations. But then Putin won re-election in 2012, and then the Magnitsky Act was passed in December, initiating the sanctions. And then the sanctions were escalated further when a coup d'etat supported by the United States occurred in Ukraine in February of 2014, and then the eastern provinces of Ukraine voted to separate, and that ignited the war in eastern Ukraine. And then the U.S. escalated the sanctions because Russia was supporting the separatist rebels in the east, and then Russia basically retook Crimea, although Crimea had been part of Russia before, and a referendum was held in which the Crimeans voted to rejoin Russia. But further sanctions were imposed for Russia's takeover of Crimea, which was considered to be illegal by the international community, although there is a different perspective among locals, because most Crimeans, polls have shown, are actually very happy to have rejoined Russia, and in part because Russia is investing in Crimea's economy, and they recently built a major land bridge to Crimea. So the polls show that Crimeans are very happy to be part of Russia now, again, because they had been part of Russia prior to 1954. But this was used, there was overheated rhetoric. I think Hillary Clinton compared Putin to Hitler, and that this was a major land grab by Russia, and that was the basis for escalating the sanctions policy. But one of the key initial lobbies behind the Magnitsky bill was this fellow William F. Browder, a billionaire hedge fund manager who had been expelled from Russia in the 2000s because he was accused of tax evasion in Russia. And then he claimed that his lawyer, well, because I don't know if anyone here has seen the film The Magnitsky Act by any chance, behind the scenes, because this film was basically blocked from commercial distribution in the United States, but it exposed Browder's story as a fraud, because Browder claimed that his company was he was a hedge fund manager, and he had this major hedge fund in Russia that was, he claimed that it was illegally seized by the Russian government, and that they scammed him out of $230 million, and that his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, exposed the scam and then was imprisoned by the Russian authorities, tortured by them, and killed. And he used that story to sell this idea of a horrible Russia and to lobby for these sanctions measures in 2012, before even the situation in Ukraine unfolded. However, this film that it was a Russian filmmaker who was actually anti-Putin, was planning to make a film showcasing abuses in the Russian criminal justice system, but as he investigated it, he found that Browder's story didn't make sense, and that there were many lies that Browder was telling, and that firstly, Magnitsky was actually his accountant, and he specialized in tax evasion practices, and he was actually under investigation by the Russian authorities for involvement in the scam, and he believes that Browder actually stole the money from the Russian government and then made up the story to demonize the Putin regime and to try and turn attention away from his own crimes in Russia. But the whole political establishment bought the story and then barred this film that exposed the duplicity of Browder, and that was the basis for the sanctions. So overall, there doesn't appear to be any legitimate basis for these sanctions apart from a con man, a billionaire con man, who has basically deceived the entire U.S. Congress about a story that appears to be false. And that, I think, is maybe unique in the sorry history of sanctions. This may be unique for them to be initiated based on a complete fraud. And it also, I was thinking of John Hobson, his maxim about how imperialism is always driven by financial elites. And we can see that in this case. If it's a billionaire hedge fund manager who's able to use his clout to effectively lobby the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government to support policies that are escalating, could lead to an escalation. It's already leading to a major arms race. It could even lead to a nuclear war in the future. With the time I have, I'll just try and now address the issue of how Russia has responded to the sanctions. Firstly, I had a couple points. Well, just so you get a scope of the sanctions, between 2012 and 2019, there are more than 60 rounds of sanctions imposed. In 2018, the Treasury Department listed 491 Russian people and entities affected, compared to 146 from China and 335 from Iran. So the scope of the sanctions is very high. A U.S. Secretary of State said that the sanctions were designed to send a message not only to Russia, but also to China and anyone who might contemplate the Crimea annexation as a model. Basically, don't mess with us. And it's clearly a politicized motive, just like in a lot of these other cases. One thing, and then in February 2019, there have been some major pieces of legislation. Then in February 2019, Senator Lindsey Graham and Robert Menendez introduced the Defending American Security from Kremlin Aggression Act, or Sanctions Bill from Hell, which seeks to escalate the sanctions further. It hasn't passed so far. But one thing I find disturbing is that a lot of these so-called progressive political candidates, and personally I support some of their policies, including people like Sanders or Cortez, but they've been basically urging on whatever administration in favor of sanctions. Cortez was among those to vote yay to disapprove the president's proposal to weaken sanctions, and voted also in favor of the NATO Support Act. Sanders voted in favor of a more robust version of the Magnitsky Act and in favor of Obama's sanctions policy in 2014 alongside military aid to Ukraine. So I think people on the left and progressives have to push these kind of individuals to adopt more progressive policies and raise awareness about what appears to be the fraudulent nature of the sanctions and also their adverse effects. And other candidates have adopted similar positions from war, and of course Joe Biden is the most Russophobic of all the candidates. As far as briefly to give an overview of the effects now of the sanctions and Putin's response, the effects have been bad. 39% of Russian business leaders said the sanctions hurt their business. The IMF estimated the sanctions linked to the invasion of Ukraine cost Russia 1 to 1.5% of GDP. Putin said Russia had lost over 160 billion due to the sanctions' impact on foreign investment. So obviously they have been very negative. Although there is a certain irrationality. One study found that while Russia lost more than 65 billion in revenue in the years 2014 and 2015, the US and EU together sustained more than 50 billion in losses. So as progressive activists, we can also point out that there is an economic cost in our society as well. ExxonMobil found, only 5 minutes, okay. And actually I found in my research that the U.S. Russian Business Council has actually been lobbying against the sanctions or to weaken legislation because of the effects, negative effects on various U.S. corporations. And finally, just because I have a few minutes left, I'll end on my point about import substitution and Putin's response. Sanctions expert Richard Connolly points out how the Putin regime used a range of tools and resources to cushion targeted sectors from the worst effects. This included primarily a shift towards greater reliance on domestic resources or Russification, and the forging of closer relations with non-Western countries, including Eurasian countries as well as China. I do have some material on that, I'll probably end with. Just to follow on the point, though, about import substitution, in August 2015, Putin formed a government commission for import substitution chaired by former President Dmitry Medvedev, and the plan included more than 2,000 projects across 19 branches of the economy with the goal of reducing the share of imported goods. About 4.5 billion was advocated to be spent directly on this program. And according to Russian government figures, by the summer of 2017, 22 sectors of the economy were receiving state support to stimulate import substitution. And this helped Russia to develop, so it basically led to growth in certain Russian industries, including agriculture, as well as Russia was able to develop some of its own technology for oil and gas extraction. It's obviously central to the Russian economy, like with Venezuela. So it's actually been beneficial in that way for Russia because they've developed certain technologies because of the tariffs and state investment. They've developed certain technologies that make them more efficient and not having to rely on foreign companies for certain technologies and products. According to Connolly, the strategy of direct state subsidization of the oil industry represented a deviation from the previous trajectory of economic policy, which had largely left the industry to the vagaries of the market. So it does represent a departure from neoliberalism, the very heavy state involvement in the economy, state subsidization of various industries, as well as the tariffs, is a deviation from neoliberal doctrine. And it seems to have had some positive effects. Putin also took measures to keep, to prevent capital flight abroad during this process. And then, since I only have a few minutes, I'll just mention the alliance with China has been strengthened. So from a geopolitical viewpoint, that's why I would say that overall I think the sanctions policy is very irrational, and it shows the danger when our policy is hijacked by an elite group of financiers. We adopt a policy that is antithetical to the interests of the majority of Americans, and also even to the geostrategic position of the United States, because it's really forced Putin into closer alliance with China. And that's the worst nightmare. This Zbigniew Brzezinski's school of grand chess theory of the world, that's his greatest nightmare, that China and Russia will get together and forge a powerful bloc to undercut the United States. In 2012, Putin expressed hope that Russia would be able to catch some of China's wind in the salvo of our economy. Then recently, Xi Jinping said that Putin is, for me, a best friend. And in 2018, trade between Russia and China grew to 108 billion. Russian aerospace and military industrial companies were purchasing electronic components worth several $billion dollars as Russia signed a valuable natural gas agreement worth 400 billion and found the market for Russian soybeans and sunflower seeds in China, which China was happy because of Trump's tariffs. And Russia has also played an active role in the BRICS Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The goal, in part, for Russia being to open new capital sources for Russian investment that would undercut dependence on Western agencies and banks and render the sanctions obsolete. There was further talk of selling yuan-denominated bonds, which would give the Russian government access to onshore Chinese investors. And then when Xi visited Russia in June 2019, Putin took him on a boat tour. It's just a symbolic example. Putin took him on a boat tour around the historic city of St. Petersburg to solidify a mutual alliance. A CEO of Russia's direct investment bank told CNBC that the sanctions hurt the United States more than Russia, largely because a lot of people were moving away from the dollar because lots of dollar transactions were getting restricted. And I point out in my commentary, these comments epitomize how the sanctions policy has failed to achieve its stated goals of weakening Russia and deterring its intervention in Ukraine, and also backfired and harmed the U.S. economy. And just as a final point, if you look at the website of the Department of Treasury, which lists the 30 active sanctions programs that the United States has in place, you find such a clear double standard, as far as human rights. That's epitomized in the fact that Yemenis are actually subjected to sanctions, where Saudi Arabians are not. And as we know, Saudi Arabia is one of the worst governments, if not the worst government in the world, the most evil people, and there's no sanctions on them. If you look at Latin America, The blatant double standard is that, the Honduran president is being investigated for drug trafficking. His son was under indictment for drug trafficking. It's a brutal regime who's been implicated in the murder of political activists. But Honduras is not subject to sanctions. Only, socialist countries such as Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So there's just such an obvious double standard, politicized dimension with these sanctions that is sorry state of affairs. So thank you.